This is a true story that I witnessed at my high school. A boy was murdered in front of me and my classmates, and the shocking thing was that it was all just over a silly Instagram chat. At the time, I was 14, and my high school was big enough that was intersected by two main buildings. The intersection point was a cafeteria where all the students used to go during lunchtime. I was a normal guy at school who was miles and miles away from those who marked themselves as the boss of the school, basically backbenchers of our class. It was a normal day, and I was waiting for my friend in the cafeteria as it was lunchtime. Suddenly, I heard a little commotion straight in the hallway. Several students went running in that direction after listening to the whole commotion, but I stayed there and ignored it as we had frequent verbal and sometimes violent fights at my school, and I was weary of it that it would all be silent in a few minutes after some verbal argument. As far as I could understand from the noise, the fight was over some Instagram chat. My friend came running from the opposite hallway and sat beside me. He knew about all this before. I asked him about the whole matter, and he told me that this fight was a result of a love triangle. A girl was responsible for all this. The two boys were chatting with the same girl on Instagram, and that girl was over smart. She was ditching both of them, and here these fools were beating each other just because of her. Both of them were unaware of the fact that the girl was claiming to be in love with both of them, and here these meatheads were fighting to own her. Till this point, the fight was mostly verbal with some pushes. I could hear both of them shouting and bickering with each other. All of a sudden, the audience became furious and started shouting. All I could hear was a loud scream. Then the crowd quickly dispersed. Some are in this direction, and the rest are in the opposite. There was a lot of screaming and crying, and within a moment, everything was clear. There was no one left in the hall except a single boy who was lying on the floor and screaming in pain. I wondered what could have happened. My friend who was sitting with me stopped someone and asked why everyone started running all of a sudden. At that moment, we came to know that one of the boys who was arguing suddenly pulled out a knife from his pocket and stabbed the other one and again in his chest. We both were shocked to know that what we were assuming to be a verbal argument turned out to be a violent one. We stood up from the chair and ran to see the scene. We saw the boy lying on the floor, and there were stab wounds on his abdomen area, chest, and near the neck area also. Until we reached there were bloodstains all over his body and the walls also. What I believe was the most horrible was the pool of blood around that boy, which covered the floor as well. We both were scared after watching blood all over there. We knew he was losing too much blood and needed instant help, but it was like we were frozen in that particular spot, and no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't move a foot. Fortunately, some teachers came running for his help and called the ambulance, but till now, he was almost non-responsive. Other than the initial screamings, there was no sound coming from him now. He needed urgent treatment, and it seemed like the ambulance was taking an eternity to arrive. After about half an hour, they finally arrived, and the boy was taken for emergency treatment. Afterward, the cop also came. I think someone from the school must have called them. The boy who did all this was hiding on the terrace, but he was held by the cops for juvenile detention. The next day, I got the news from my friend that the boy who was stabbed died. After 2 months, I went to another town far away to attend college and never listened about that case. As I think about that incident now, it was like a nightmare, like being in the theater and watching a movie where the killer went on a rampage and killed someone. Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so. I ended up matching with this girl on Hinge, and don't ask me how, but the topic of conversation ended up being piercings. She had a bunch of visible and apparently not visible piercings, and after I mentioned considering a nose piercing a while ago, we got into it and as to why I didn't get one. I was honest. I told her I put it off because I was scared it had hurt, but the longer I put it off, the less I wanted it, if that makes sense. Until in the end, I was just not that fast on getting it done. She playfully takes offense to this, called me a little baby, and saying we should go on a piercing date together. I told her we should probably wait until at least the third date to go full daddy dom, a joke obviously, and the conversation then kind of meandered into other topics. Cut it to our first date. Everything going pretty good. We get beer and wings. We're getting on well. And then she says she has a surprise for me. I'm pretty stoked at the idea. I couldn't possibly guess what it was. But if she'd brought me a gift or like something or somewhere cool to take me, I thought that was pretty thoughtful. Anyway, ask what it is. And she says she can't show me in the wings place. I have to wait until we get outside. Kind of mysterious, right? And that only makes the anticipation build and build until the time we finally do get outside. And I'm incredibly excited to see what she's got in store for me. So like I said, she had a lot of piercings and was kind of like a punk chick in general. There is little context for the fact that she had this cut-off denim jacket on with like 3 or 4 safety pins running through one of the collars. She takes one of the safety pins and fastens it, and before I could even ask her what she was thinking, she rams the sharp of it through both, I repeat, both of her nostrils. See? Doesn't hurt at all, she said, as all this blood starts trickling out of her nostrils and down onto her lips. Now you've got no excuse not to. No matter how much I insisted, this girl was determined to pierce at least one of my nostrils and went from like a playful ha-ha, no thanks, to me physically resisting her and even telling her to get off of me. As you can imagine, this caused quite a scene as she legit looked like she'd been punched in the mouth. And now we're having a full-on shouting match right about the time she screams, "What's your problem?" I realize there's an actual crowd gathered, and a lot of the crowd seems to think that the girl's mouth is bloody because I hit her. Now, let me make it clear, even when I'm trying to keep this girl from shoving a piece of metal on my face, I didn't get physical with her at all. The most I did was grabbed her wrist and kept it away from me. Because even if she was only joking around, all it would take after a few beers would be a slip or a trip. Or why am I even justifying this? Don't put pieces of sharp metal near the other person's faces and expect a good reaction. But anyway, this little crowd started forming, and most people are concerned with the girl if she needed 911, calling for a mouth helpful stuff or accusation stuff. But on the other hand, there's a few dudes circling me like, "Did you just lay your hands on her, bruh? Think you're tough hitting on a lady like that?" And after all that kind of stuff, I obviously fire back by telling them it's none of their business. But as soon as the words leave my lips, I realize that although it wasn't any of their business and it wasn't what they thought it was, if anything, mind your own business just confirmed that I was some woman beating POS. But the worst thing when it became obvious when I was being accused of the girl, then so offended by my piercing rejection that she did absolutely nothing to reassure anyone that I hadn't hit her. The last thing I did before I had to just flee the entire scene was look over to her like, "Really? You're like this?" And it turns out she was. Because what else would you want to call a girl that turns a perfectly nice date into a potential lynching in the space of about 10 minutes? If those dudes had caught up to me, or if they weren't so drunk or hadn't been as athletic as I was at the time, I'd probably have had my head bashed into the sidewalk, and there's a decent chance I wouldn't have the brain function to even be writing this. So please be careful with the kind of people you're meeting up with on dating apps. I think one of the coolest things promoted with them as the whole video dating thing that's introduced during this whole pandemic thing. I mean, not so much because they're corona compliant or whatever, more because I feel like you get a much better idea of someone's personality that way. And if I had done that with Piercer Girl and got a hint of how intense she was, I might not have been so quick to take her out. And taking her out not only led to the single worst date I've ever been on, but also one of the scariest nights of my entire life. I live here in New Zealand, and late in 2018, I was feeling sort of lonely, so I decided to download the dating app Tinder to try and find myself a nice guy to go on a few dates with. Maybe even find myself a long-term boyfriend out of it. I ended up matching with this guy who'd come over from Australia, and we chatted for 2 weeks before we finally met up. The conversation was quite light, nothing too heavy, and it was fun. Like I said, it was from Australia. So we talked about Aussie things, and I remember telling him how much I wanted to visit Melbourne. He said that he'd been there once or twice and started making recommendations for some great coffee shops that he knew of. He seemed like a nice, normal guy, and when we agreed to meet, I was happy to do that. But then maybe 5 days or so before we were due to meet, he got really persistent and impatient. He would text me multiple times in a day, and if I didn't reply straight away, he would ask if something was wrong. I thought it was weird that he was being so clingy after starting off so confident. He kept trying to bring the date forward so we could meet up sooner and would totally forget. If I had told him I was busy on a particular day, almost like he wasn't paying attention or didn't care about what I had to say. It was honestly really unusual for someone to be that persistent with me. I did guys before who were maybe a bit persistent, but only have a nervous excitement. Different kind of excitement than this awesome guy seemed to be. I just couldn't understand why it was that he could not possibly wait until the Sunday that we'd arranged to meet. It felt very narcissistic, and I should have seen it as the red flag that it was and not just meet up with him at all. I had the messages saved on my phone for a while, so I had a record of the exact dates and times that he sent some of the messages. So on the 2nd of December, he messaged me just after 9 a.m. saying, "Good morning, how are you?" And again about an hour and a half later. I didn't reply to the first message because I was asleep, but I think he took it the wrong way because he said it was fine if I changed my mind and didn't feel like going on the date. That was when I messaged him back and confirmed that I would meet him later on that day. We met up and went to a place called Revelry. It's a very standard bar, very popular, and lots of people go there, but it's definitely more of a nighttime bar. I had never drunk there during the afternoon or the daytime, but it was open, seemed like it had a chill atmosphere, and he wanted to go there, so that's where we went. He was a bit bigger than the pictures on his Tinder profile showed, and it was obvious that he had put on a little bit of weight. He had big distinctive eyes and he was very, very clean cut. I mean, like his clothes looked freshly washed and ironed. He was also very well groomed. Obviously took good care of his skin and stuff like that. Like he was really good looking. I remember asking him a lot of different questions, and he just sort of talked to me. He tried to ask me a few questions, but they weren't very in-depth ones. I thought he was a bit nervous, to be honest, but that's not unusual for a first date. But things start to sort of unravel at one point, because he had said one thing in messages about where he worked and a different thing on the date. I started to feel a bit uneasy, like I wanted to trust him, but as soon as he started to put on some inconsistencies, I began to wonder if he was just lying about stuff to impress me, because he was from Australia. I asked him the whereabouts that he had met his Kiwi friends, and he told me that all his friends were police officers or somehow involved in law enforcement. He said how he had met with them while out drinking in various bars. Have they gotten to know each other over time? And they regularly invite him back to their places over barbecues and stuff like that. He also mentioned that his best friend from Australia was coming over to be a Crown Court prosecutor. That's why I noticed that a lot of the stuff that he was talking about kind of had this running theme to it. It kind of seemed like he was obsessed with that sort of thing, which in hindsight explains an awful lot. I think he was sort of trying to process some of the things that he had been up to over the previous few days, and it came out in his conversation style. He obviously thought an awful lot about policemen, dead bodies, and ways people can be killed, prosecution justice in the court system, and it just came out in a very strange way like that on our first date. Like I said before, we talked quite a lot about him being friends with lots of different policemen, and he went into quite a bit of depth regarding the details of certain investigations that they apparently shared with him. He said that we're having a really tough time around the time because of bodies going missing in the White Toggy Ranges. He told me that police corpse sniffing dogs can only detect decaying flesh about 4 feet deep under the soil, so if the bodies are buried in a deeper than that, the police won't be able to find them. I thought it was a bit of a morbid thing to talk about on the first date, but it was an interesting fact nonetheless. He also got into a conversation about all the different kinds of poisonous snakes in Australia, and he became quite animated about it. He obviously had a passion for the natural world. It was quite out there, but I thought it was cute. I love animals too, so I was glad we had something in common and made me feel a bit more relaxed again. But then, right as I started feeling comfortable with him again, he started telling me this really bizarre and creepy story. He told me how crazy it is that a guy can make one little mistake and then go to jail for the rest of his life for it. He went on to tell me about this guy he knew back in Oz who had consensual intimacy involving choking with his girlfriend, then that ended up accidentally killing her in the process. He assured me that the whole thing was a horrible, tragic accident, how things just went wrong suddenly, and how the guy was really upset because he loved her and would never hurt her on purpose. But still, the guy got done for manslaughter and was sent to prison for a long, long time. What I know now is this could have been him testing on his story on me when he was able to see that I was a bit uncomfortable with what he was saying. He tried to change the subject, so we could talk about more mundane things. I didn't try to make a swift exit or anything. I'm quite used to dealing with all sorts of people. And I'm not saying people who talk about dark things on the first date are like bad people or anything, but it was definitely weird. We hung out for a while. But after about 3 hours or so, I made some excuses as to why I had to leave, and we said goodbye. As we were parting ways, he said, "My car is this way," and pointed off down a particular road. My car was down the same road. But at that stage, I was feeling uneasy and my instincts had just kicked in telling me to walk a different way. He was also a lot bigger than me, so if something went wrong, I knew I wouldn't be able to defend myself. In hindsight, it was a good decision. It was my intuition sense. My brain was saying this was strange. That was strange. And looking back on it now, it is really strange to think of who he actually was. I don't think it is the realm of what normal human brains can comprehend. But just the day before we met up, the guy was out on that first date with had murdered a girl in his hotel room, a British girl called Grace MacLeod. The reason he had brought up his friend accidentally strangling his girlfriend is because that's exactly how he'd kill her. Although whether or not he was on purpose is another question entirely. Also, the reason he had mentioned the whole Toggery mountain range is because that's where he ended up disposing of her body. And all that other stuff about sniffer dogs was research that he'd been doing the previous night that was still sort of consuming his mind. It is hard to look back and think that that had just happened to her. From what I understand, while we were on our date, her body was still in that hotel room of his, hidden under the bed or something, wrapped in a blanket. There's nothing I could have done, and I know that now, but it is still really hard to come to terms with that. I do think if it had been a date in the evening, potentially, I could have been a victim. I take a lot of solace in the fact that I do have my wits about me, and do take safety in online dating quite seriously, and that is nothing against any women who are willing to go home with someone on the first date. But I do want to say to young women who take one more step in your thinking when you're on a date, to see how well you know this person actually. Since then, I have been on dates with lovely, trustworthy men, but think how well do I really know them? It has made me go a little slower and divulge a little less personal information to them. I know in modern dating, it is quite common to give people your Instagram handle, but you aren't giving people access to a lot of personal information. It is really dangerous. And I just want to encourage people to take a step back and think before they do that. There's nothing wrong with taking a step back, taking it slow and pacing yourself a bit. Alcohol has a big effect. It is part of the social fabric of dating and part of life these days, but it still comes with a massive risk. Women need to be really aware of how much they are drinking on dates, and unfortunately, drinks are sometimes spiked. We live in this world where people are still idealistic about how things should be on dates, but incidents like these take things back 10 or 20 years, or women are still having to grip their keys between their fingers, or can't leave a drink on the table. We aren't as developed as we think we are in areas such as dating. Technology has gotten ahead of us. I think people are as they always are, I think with the advancement of technology, we thought we would become more refined, but we are just the same, but with new technology. I think the invention of dating apps is a wonderful thing, and I wouldn't want to live in a world without that. But I just wished for a world where women don't have to think about their safety all the time.